The Golden Verses of the Pythagoreans is the title given to a comparatively brief poem, the original authorship being unknown. Traditionally, it is believed that these verses were written by Pythagoras himself. There is much to indicate the possibility, but the actual facts are not available. We know, however, that at a comparatively early period, these verses were regarded as a true exposition of his teaching, and the internal content binds them very closely to the school of Pythagoras. As we realize, very little has come down to us in the actual words of this great Greek philosopher. He is recognized and revered principally for the mysterious impact which he bestowed upon the entire field of classical learning. Nearly all who came after him in Western culture have admitted indebtedness to his system. Yet this system has survived mostly through interpretation and commentary by other persons. Pythagoras flourished in the 6th century before the Christian era. His school at Crotona was ultimately destroyed by vandalism, and it is believed that the master himself was martyred. At the time of the destruction of the academy, or institute, the buildings were burned, and it is assumed that this is the cause of the loss of such manuscripts or documents as might have survived about him. We also know that he was little given to placing his teachings in written form. He taught mostly in person and by conduct, and therefore only those who received advancement within his school were permitted to have direct contact with him and to receive orally the instruction which he bestowed. Some fragments in writing, either his own or notes by his disciples, did survive. These have more or less disappeared in the course of time, unless we are to assume that the best of them have been gathered into the Golden Verses. One of the outstanding interpreters and commentators upon these verses was Heracles, and we are indebted to him for the form and beauty with which the verses have descended to our time. Nor should the student expect to find within this brief structure any elaborate dissertation upon Pythagoreanism. As again might be suspected from the nature of the man, the verses are very largely a summary of the practical aspect of philosophy. In these verses, a way of conduct is exemplified, and the truth seeker is brought into gentle but strong association with the Pythagorean mood about learning. It was evidently the teaching of this great philosopher that all philosophy was for two purposes, and that by various applications these purposes led to ultimate enlightenment. The first end of philosophy was the life of virtue, and the second end of philosophy was the restoration of the state of the soul in its relation to truth. This was conceived to be a twofold path, because in the first part, man, by a series of decisions made in his own nature and of his own free will, qualified himself for learning. The second and following part assumed this qualification had been attained, and that from that point on, the mind and the reason, liberated from ignorance and error, could proceed directly toward the contemplation of reality. The verses are a sort of Orphic hymn, much in the classical mode of the time, and begin with the importance of man establishing the practice or habit of venerating naturally and simply that which required or invited veneration. Therefore, the verse is open with the simple reminder that it is the duty of all good persons to venerate the good, to hold in highest esteem those divine powers which are the fountains of good. Thus man is encouraged to acknowledge and to learn to adore and understand the spiritual roots and beginnings of our life. And in the Greek manner, it would be natural that the verses should therefore open with a kind of hymn, inviting the truth seeker to pay homage to the gods, the heroes, to just persons, and those who by various achievements and attainments have become worthy of our deepest and most continuing regard. It was the natural practice of the Greeks to invite the individual to grow through a kind of discrimination, and this is represented in the opening sections of the verses. The individual who can perceive the good, though he may not yet practice it, who has this discrimination within in himself to honor first that which is most honorable, to venerate first that which is most venerable, will through these procedures come to recognize the importance and dignity of good things. If we give our lives cheerfully and our hearts and minds gladly to those things which are best, if within ourselves we gradually develop a code in which we honor, respect, and revere those qualities which are most eternal, most worthy of our general and continuing admiration, then we are constantly presenting ourselves with good ideas. We are constantly reminding ourselves of the importance of the life of virtue as the pathway leading to the attainment of truth. Now, many persons today in our way of life do not feel very much respect or reverence or veneration for anything. And we sort of feel today that to bestow such a mood is to fall under a kind of antique pattern. Yet, Pythagoras was probably wiser than most moderns, not in the fact that we should go about worshiping each other. Such was not the intent of the verses, but rather that we should have discrimination enough to choose to bestow our largest admiration upon that which deserves it. For only by so thinking and feeling, only by giving of ourselves to that which is a just and legitimate requirement, can we maintain our own orientation in this world. One of our troubles in the modern world is that we venerate the wrong things. And because man is a venerating creature, he must have his heroes. We all must respect something. And Pythagoras points out that when we respect that which is superior, we inevitably incline ourselves to become like that superior. Where our heroes are, there our allegiances are also. And that which we really believe to be better, we inevitably and instinctively emulate. If, therefore, we emulate the wrong things, if we choose our heroes from the wrong levels of attainment, then instinctively and clearly we are indicating weaknesses in our own natures. Everywhere, in everything, man should reserve his respect for that which challenges him to greater attainment. The craftsman instinctively respects a superior artisan, one whose knowledge is greater than his own. The average musician respects the greater musical genius. The average physician respects the great physician. All of us are inclined to respect achievement in fields that we understand. And this instinct should lead us ultimately to recognize the need to venerate those great principles in the universe, which are the fullness of all qualities, which today we recognize and practice only in part. If, therefore, in any generation we examine those persons or things most admired and respected, we come into a valuable psychological key to the qualities of that generation, to its instinctive interests and indifferences. If we then are to progress along the way of philosophic enlightenment, we must begin to respect those qualities, those beings, those principles in nature toward which we are striving, and which we must visualize, at least within ourselves, if we are to have the courage and industry to proceed to the attainment. This then becomes a continual, gentle remembrance of great and good things, and our willingness to choose between good, better, and best, always seeking to discover the best, and by so doing to challenge ourselves to be like the best. I think this more or less summarizes the opening thought of the verses. From this opening thought, we then move naturally to the beginnings of philosophy. And these beginnings have to do with the refinement of conduct. All growth begins with a kind of dedication. The individual cannot proceed unless he regards the end to justify the effort. Unless he has purpose, he will never move directly toward it. Unless he has an archetypal conviction, he will not live according to that conviction. Thus we come upon what might be termed the theological overtone of the verses, namely the man gradually experiencing within himself, through learning, through observation, through association, gradually experiencing the fact that there is a better way of life than that which we commonly live, and that this better way of life has rewards and opens doors and brings consolations that the lesser way of life cannot experience. Thus the verses invite the individual to recognize that a superior way of life is man's protection against those conditions which arise from an inferior way of life. That growth is continuous, and that therefore man is constantly seeking nobler and fuller expressions for his own internal resources. Thus the beginning of man's life of discipline is not effective unless this discipline is purposed. The individual cannot discipline himself, nor will he find the incentives or the moral support of his own energies unless this discipline is purposeful, unless it becomes the most important thing in all the world. The individual will not have the energy and the continuity and the dedication to carry it on toward the attainment of self-improvement. Pythagoras obviously knew in his time, we find records historically bearing upon these matters, that the average person, though he be uncomfortable, miserable, variously dilemmaed, does not in all these negative circumstances have sufficient energy or sufficient inducement to correct his own way of life. He is rather hope against miracles, phenomena of some kind which will save him in spite of himself. He seeks to surround himself with comforts to substitute for the absence of securities. He is forever compromising because his incentives and his inducements are not great enough. Now, the Pythagoreans were well aware that man's inducements must clarify with his growth. The individual in a state of ignorance cannot be certain of those great good things which are the ends of wisdom. Yet discipline comes to him from another source, whether he be certain or not. And this source lies in the religious conviction of his peoples. In those days, of course, what we would term today the agnostic or the atheist were rare. There were not great numbers of persons who were unbelievers, who did not have some faith or substance of belief in themselves. Therefore, the beginning of this discipline was to a degree simple religious virtue. The individual standing in the presence of the Decalogue delivered by Moses, or listening gently and quietly to a reading of the Beatitudes, was moved not by reason, but by faith, by the recognition that these words, these commandments, these great institutes were wise, were benevolent, and were so considered as to make life best for him. So the beginning of the life of virtue is the acceptance of the divine way, as brought by revelation, by teachers, by venerated prophets, and by the great spiritual leaders of the race. Under these conditions, the individual may turn to piety simply because it is the good way, not because he understands why, but because he knows in his daily conduct that persons who live this way are better friends, better relations, more honorable associates in all the walks of life. He learns in his daily living that we finally depend for our safety in this world upon the honor of others, and that this honor is important to us, and that our honor is important to them. Thus, the honorable life must precede the life of discipline. It must be a way in which, for reasons commonly obvious, we do those things commonly approved as good, maintaining constantly with it the simple faith that the performance of these good things is not only acceptable to our fellow men, but is in harmony with the great religious and spiritual universe in which we exist. So in the beginning all things may not be clear, but that good is desirable is universally accepted, and that which is desirable shall be practiced on all occasion and with all fortitude, and the individual shall, in the service of good, strengthen such resources as he may possess. So the Pythagorean golden verses begin to emphasize the gradual establishment of value. They begin to point out how man attains to his natural human estate, and that this estate begins in the cultivation of adequate self-control in all things, that there can be no victory for the individual who is unable to direct his own life, that this direction of life becomes more clear as we proceed, but that at any stage the individual must still be the leader of the total of himself. So we have another ancient classical axiom, namely that man as a being, as a center of life and light, must lead his total personality and never be the victim of it. Thus the best part of man must govern man, even as the best part of men must govern the rest. And as God, being the best part of the universe, leads all of it, so in every creature there is a God. There is a supreme being, or power, or principle, that which is superior to the rest, and this must always guide the rest. if the individual is not led by the best of himself, he falls not only into evil, but falls away from religion. For the best part in all things is that part most like God. And not to be led by that is to fall into error. Thus the God in things must be the protector, the guardian, the teacher, the guide, and the master of all the parts of its own nature. So man seeking for understanding, seeking for discipline, seeking ways to put his life in order that he may be acceptable to the Most High, must first of all choose or select the best of himself and make this leader of the rest. Now, in the Pythagorean system, being a philosophical school, it was assumed that in man, that which we call reason is the best part. Now, reason is not just mind, nor is it just emotion, nor is it just higher thinking. Reason is that thing or power or faculty in man which determines the reasonable, which determines those things possible, likely, those things next in sequence. Reason not only lifts man from a lesser state, but it prevents him from tumbling headlong into an unknown state. Reason not only hastens him from his ignorance, but reason also slows his step when he comes to things more difficult than he can immediately manage. Thus reason becomes a constant impulse toward the reasonable. And the reasonable in turn is the essence or principle behind the practical. Therefore all things truly practical are reasonable, and all things truly reasonable are practical. And that which is practical is that which makes possible in each instance the greater good. Thus all practical purposes are those purposes best calculated to most directly attain a desirable and necessary end. That reason should lead, therefore, means that the individual should be led by his own discriminating power. And discrimination is not only a stimulant, a principle of aspiration in man, it is a moderator. It is a guardian against all excess. And Pythagoras was one of the first to point out that aspiration not controlled by moderation can itself be an excess. And that there are many virtues which, if over-practiced, become vices. And nearly all virtues, separated from the total pattern of the way of virtue, isolated and broken off from the parent stem, will themselves lead to confusion and discord. So the reasonable must in all other things be the governor, most suitable to be venerated, most worthy of our admiration. And by the reasonable, the Pythagoreans pointed out that in man, these reasonable powers are like the divine powers of the universe. They are not only the guides, but of themselves and in themselves. They are the sources of the reasonable world, a world of things essentially good, until through ignorance and through man's own lack of discipline, they are brought into inharmonious proportions and relations. Thus man is to be guided and led by the reasonable, by the cultivation of his own faculties and powers, so that he may become a reasoning being. Now, reasoning also points out that in life nothing must be done without a reason, and nothing for which there is a reason may be left undone. So the Pythagoreans were very strict on this point, that the moment it becomes obvious that we have a need, that need must be met. And it must be met in a manner that is in accordance with the laws governing right action. And in everything, a problem always implies that man has not yet focused his own reason and his resource upon some circumstance of life. man can never be problemed by that which is less than himself, but he is always in the presence of problem when he deals with that which is in excess of himself. Therefore he must grow, and solution is always the enlargement of himself, so that he becomes greater than the problem that confronts him. Now the reasonable, if it is once enthroned as the governor of life, and its responsibilities and its proprieties are delineated, the reasonable then begins to demand of man that he unite all other resources in its service, that all things must lead to a fulfillment of reasonable ends and purposes, and that man's composite nature must serve his enlightenment, contribute to it, and assist him to grow more rapidly. The Pythagoreans then begin their natural disciplines, the disciplines of reason, by telling the individual to look into himself. And to look into himself, they established a discipline which is strongly emphasized in the golden verses. And this is the discipline which we might call retrospection. That every person at the end of his day must sit down and turn his own life into a text for his own enlightenment. Most of us are so busy contemplating the works of others, disagreeing with the opinions of others, and dissatisfied with the conduct of others, that they totally ignore self-analysis. Yet self-analysis is more vital to man than the analysis of anything else. For by self-analysis, man begins to prepare the disciplining of his own conduct. Thus, to the Pythagoreans, philosophy is not an intellectual pursuit. It is a way of life. It is life under the discipline of the reasonable. And any abstraction that cannot be immediately associated with immediate conduct must be held in suspension until the proper time. The mind shall never go into vagary. It shall never substitute intellectual activity for discipline. It shall never retire into a contemplative existence by which it is permitted to ignore conduct. The individual is not to sit in a mountain somewhere looking down indifferently upon his own conduct. He must grow through his conduct and must use his own personal experience as the great text which will lead him toward the life of discrimination. If he becomes sincere in this, if he is honest, he will then be able to look back not only upon the preceding day, but perhaps upon preceding years, and begin to benefit by the things that he has along the way rejected. Man is forever rejecting truth. The moment this truth appears uncomfortable, the moment it differs from his own personal pleasure, will, design, or opinion, he promptly forgets it or ignores it. But out of his retrospection, he may restore it again as a guide and lead to conduct. In going back through the day, the verses tell us that it is the duty of each individual to perceive through contemplation those procedures which he has practiced and the results which they have attained. He should search for those things which he has done well and observe the useful consequences. He should perceive those things which he has not done well and notice how they brought misery or misfortune upon himself and others. He must search out also the good things which he has not done, which had he performed them would have gained advantage to his world or to himself. Also the things which were bad which he has performed, and should gradually use his own life as a textbook. He may always say to himself in the Pythagorean mood, if I am not happy, if I am not adjusted, if I am not constructively dedicated, then there is something wrong with me. Now, Pythagoras makes this tremendous point, that it is utterly worthless for an individual to be miserable and at the same time say that he is right. He cannot. He may be right in a sense, but that sense is not great enough. He may have been true to the wrong things. His insight may not have been great enough to lift him above the level of problem. But the individual who cannot solve his problem in some reasonable way is not, as yet, capable of regarding himself as above error. He is imperfect, or his works are perfect. And that which is essentially true will never result in that which is essentially untrue. Always then, the individual's discrimination must be strengthened through the observation and reflection upon the consequences of immediate conduct. Man may also gain from this a certain reference frame. And having considered these matters in relation to his own nature, he may reconsider them in the nature of tradition and of example and of experiences with others around him, or out of the memory of his religions, philosophies, arts, and sciences. He will then observe that though they may be persecuted in their own time and regarded as offenders in their day, those whom the world best loves and most remembers are those who were true to the great discipline of ethics. That those who have practiced certain virtues have gained certain everlastingness as a reward. So the person, thinking in terms of self-improvement, can see not only a personal advantage but a universal advantage. He can perceive the justification, and he can also perceive that the attainment is possible, for others have attained it, and by attaining have become the universal benefactors of mankind. The verses then stress this important practical self-analysis, that the person should use his own life as a constant and immediate text, and by so doing, and using every available amount of reason that he possesses, he must begin to invoke the central part of life. For example, if an individual is utterly confused, and there is no center of integration within him, then obviously the divine part of his own nature is submerged. For deity cannot be confused. Truth and reason cannot be confused. And if man, looking upon a stormy sea within his own psychic life, sees within himself no strength, no hope, no verisimilitude, then that individual has failed, or is failing, to call upon those resources most available to him. He must then gradually restore the dignity of superiors within his own nature. He must do so because he must have leadership. The failure of central leadership means confusion and chaos, and no individual can do well in a chaos. Thus he must elevate some principle within himself, and this principle, by whatever name he calls it, is still the personification of the divine attribute. Some individuals in this emergency seek to draw into integration the concept of God, hoping in this to find an inward strength against outward stress. Others may seek to build character or conduct. They may say, at least I will be honest, or I shall try to see good in all things, or I shall place love above hate, or I shall place wisdom above ignorance, or I shall regard the need for the improvement and integration of my own resources. I will put learning above lack of learning. I will put knowledge above lack of knowledge. I will put order above chaos. Whatever we do, whatever decision we make, we must elect from our parts a leader, and that leader must guide us. And that leader must be some phase, value, or quality of good, something strong enough to inspire us to go on. The moment we establish this leadership, many of our troubles cease. Most of our chaos and confusion is overcome. The golden verses state it rather modestly. They say that the individual who has this true internal leadership suffers from a minimum of ills. Whereas others have many disasters, this leadership gradually reduces disaster. We may not immediately dispel all of it, but that part which we cannot dispel, we are now enabled to meet and carry with natural dignity. So for man in his various intermediate stages between ignorance and wisdom, we depend upon the leadership of the best in ourselves, and we depend upon reason bestowing patience, bestowing understanding, and making all things a little more useful, so that we are often able to recognize the wisdom and goodness in those circumstances which previously disturbed us. Little by little, through these disciplines, then, we begin the integration of a useful and constructive life. Now, the Pythagoreans imposed the discipline of reason upon the immediacy of conduct in this way. They said that man naturally is responsive to impulse, and that in a moment of emergency, the impulse comes first and the reason comes later. Therefore, it is up to man to remove emergency as far as conceivably possible from his entire pattern of life. Emergency is not as stupendous, tremendous, or inevitable as we think. That which most frequently and easily corrects or prevents emergency is moderation. Nearly all emergency arises from an immoderate situation. Emergency, for instance, arises when we have delayed too long in the use of judgment. Emergency arises when we come into the presence of the unexpected, when in sober truth we should have expected long before. Emergency comes with the impact of a sudden incident, yet there are very few sudden incidents in life. Thus, emergencies may be reduced. There are some which we probably cannot immediately cope with. But the daily emergencies which lead us to the common mistakes, which in turn gather to cause an unhappy life, these emergencies are most of them to be easily prevented, easily met, if the individual will use discrimination and will be led by the principle of wisdom within himself. Thus, our life to escape emergency must be, says the verses, the life of moderation. Moderation, for instance, in itself cuts away from us much discord. Moderation in all things will not only assist us to rule our affairs more adequately, but will liberate much of our time from the burden of critical situations. Moderation also prevents those excesses of temperament by which we push matters too rapidly, or also will prevent us from permitting emotion to dominate conduct in a critical situation. Moderation is the reduction of excess. It is the reduction of ambition to reasonable bounds, itself something that will protect health, happiness, and help to strengthen the relations of life. I was talking to a family not long ago in which the family is bankrupt simply because the man of the family is inordinately ambitious. He is so ambitious to attain certain things that he is neglecting life itself for these things. And in all probability, if he continues his present course, he is heading into a nervous breakdown, or he is heading into a heart difficulty. And this ambitious man, who has had no time to live as a father, a husband, and a friend, will probably drop dead in his 50s without ever having achieved the natural good things which life could bestow. Naturally, his attitudes are warped by the lack of social adjustments, and he is a poor person because his ambitions have never been moderated by other values. Always, moderation releases energy from things inferior and dedicates it to the attainment of things superior. Moderation in living reduces the jealousies and envies of our associates. When we try to live beyond our means, we make enemies. We also destroy the trust that people have. And when we become hopelessly in debt, we destroy our own security. By doing all things moderately and reasonably, living in the natural dignity of our kind, and placing the attainment of value above the attainment of things, yet at the same time neglecting no duty or obligation. Thus we become moderate creatures, and through moderation relieve ourselves of a great variety of emergencies. The individual who has all lost his furniture, his automobile, and his house because he could not keep up his payments is a person confronted with an emergency, and we may be sorry for him. But he will continue to have emergency because it is in himself and not in the financing corporation. He has simply failed to be moderate. He has failed to be thoughtful. He has failed to let reason guide his conduct. Therefore, he is in trouble. And as Pythagoras even then pointed out, such men in such emergency curse the gods, failing utterly to see that it is their own mistake. By moderation also, we reduce pressures, and pressures release thought. And where pressures come down to a moderate level, the individual has greater mental leisure. He has greater opportunity to plan. The more emergency-filled his life is, the less energy he has for planning and purpose. And ultimately, he becomes totally absorbed in his desperate effort to adjust to the moment. He lives for the moment and dies in one of those moments. Thus, the disciplines of Pythagoras begin with a very practical situation, namely this placing of a good shepherd, a leader of souls, inside of each person. This shepherd that is kindly to the wayward sheep, and even kindly to the black sheep, the one faculty in us which does not like to get better. And we continue to wander, but the good shepherd and his kindly dog, which is philosophy, for philosophy is the dog of wisdom, helps to bring back the sheep again, and keeps them in the sheepfold, which is the right way and the right place, and is security. Consequently, in all these things, man must become his own good shepherd, watching the flock of his emotions and desires, and making certain that the stray sheep does not fall victim to the wolf of avarice. If he is careful, thoughtful, and loving in these pursuits, he is already tempering himself, beginning to have the possibility of internal experience. For actually, when we put our outer life in order, we free our inner life. We give it an opportunity to do those things and be that thing which is right. Now, as we begin to overcome these weaknesses, we clarify the values in terms of internal. We discover that the ways of the internal are more beneficial, more pleasant, more useful than the ways of the external. We realize that every part of ourselves, and in the golden verses some emphasis is placed upon the body, that it is proper that man should regard the body as the instrument of his purpose, that he should be kind to it, guard it, take care of it, and preserve it by his own reason from any excess that will injure it. But if his own reason and his own emotions themselves are addicted to excess, then he works a terrible hardship on his body, bringing it down to ruin and bringing with it the ruin of his inner life. Thus the importance that man's leadership shall be complete, but always benevolent. Man is not